Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Elkbit. I'm talking about the 1995 album from Doopees, Doopee Time. Alright, got another Patreon request. Sorry for how slow these have gotten. Hoping I'll be able to fit maybe one more in for this year, and presumably we'll have more time for these in 2025, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, today we're going to Japan in the mid-90s to talk about a little project called Doopee Time. Doopees is a fictional vocal group masterminded by Japanese artist Yann Tomita, featuring singer Suzy Kim playing herself, and Caroline Novak being played by Yumiko Ono from Buffalo Daughter. Also, the drummer Chika Ogawa is sometimes credited as a full-time member and sometimes not. Really, this whole thing is a glorified solo project from Yann Tomita anyway. It's all his vision and direction and production. He plays synths and turntables and steel drums and brings in loads of guest musicians too. I feel like I may have heard Tomita's name in passing a few times before this request was sent in. He did play steel drums on Ryuichi Sakamoto's solo album Ongaku Zukan in the mid-early 80s. He's also worked with Cornelius, Toate, Seiko Ito, apparently worked with Grandmaster Flash once as well, among many others. He's been credited as the first Japanese hip-hop producer, having gotten his start in the genre in the late 80s, as well as the first professional Japanese steel drum player. I haven't heard anything else he's released outside of this one project, though his discography is surprisingly small, with only a couple of other albums and side projects, which very quickly dry up once you get past some point in the mid-2000s. And this album is probably the most popular record attributed to him directly. It seems to be one of those big, under-the-radar critical darlings, and I've seen people talk about this album as if it's one of their literal favorite records of all time. I mean, the Avalanches were apparently fans too, since they sampled it when they made Since I Left You, on Frontier Psychiatrist no less. Before making this video, I never would have realized the snippets of "a bird" and "yeah" came from two completely different sources, and that the latter was really Yumiko Ono's voice from this album. Now, I will freely admit that this wasn't really one of the requests on the schedule I was necessarily looking forward to the most. When it got sent in without any of that context about who Tomita was or his background, I just briefly previewed through it and heard a bizarre mix of what sounded like 50s show tunes, 60s bubblegum pop, experimental electronic pieces, sample mashups, and a lot of really high-pitched singing. I had no idea what to make of that, or whether that would end up being to my taste, though, you know, it fell enough within my format to allow. And I'm gonna be honest, 4 full attention listens later, I'm still not entirely sure what to make of Doopee Time. It's a very weird and all-over-the-place album, and I'd be lying if I said I truly got where the people who hold this up as one of their literal all-time favorites were coming from. But, you know, it was also a bit of a grower. I certainly enjoyed it more than I would have thought, based on my initial impressions from briefly previewing through it. There are specific moments on this project that did really hit for me, even if there were seemingly just as many that didn't. And say what you will about this project, absolutely no one can call this a boring listen. There aren't many projects I can think of off the top of my head that match together quite so many different genres in this short of a time and still gets them to make some kind of twisted sense together through their loose concepts. It's not the kind of thing you'll easily be able to guess where it's going at any point, and I can especially see this standing apart from the crowd back in 1995 when this came out, and see how it might have influenced many later artists on the scene in Japan. Or at least reasonably assume as someone who is not Japanese and who was literally one day old when this album came out, so has to find out about all of this through somewhat scarce information on the internet. Now, to give the album some credit right off the bat, it does start on a very indicative note. There's a 30-second intro of the two singers talking to each other about vibes and time and space, which is kind of a running thing through the entire album. Like, almost every track has these two singers, like, just kind of having quick dialogue with each other. The album doesn't really have a plot or story, but it kind of pretends to have one, as Suzy and Caroline are kind of treated as these protagonist characters in some kind of loosely sketched stage play. They go places, they do things, they feel feelings, they think thoughts. There's not much rhyme or reason to what they do or where they go, but they do always talk about the music they're participating in as if all of this is part of some greater journey they're going on. And even more indicative of the general tone of this album is the title track and functional opener, That pretty much gives the whole game away on what this album's deal is. You're just getting lots of chopped up orchestral samples that are so bright and cheerful they may as well be a step away from having been arranged by Herb Alpert. The two singers doing some ridiculously cutesy scatting thing to fit with the title. Doopina, 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 doopina. Caroline nearly runs out of breath and Susie tells her she should get more air. Thanks for the help. There's also opera singer samples that I swear sound just like the ones the Avalanches used on their track Electricity. This whole thing sounds like the opening theme to a TV show, and it will unfixably stick in your head. Which I don't mind, because I do like the way this arrangement sounds and the energy it has behind it, with no elements that got too annoying for me. It works great for what it's going for. But almost immediately after that, I start to struggle with some of the directions this album does decide to go in. See, this is an album all about kitsch. And while some moments here are kitschy in a fun way, other moments get to a level of kitschiness that can start to become difficult for me to swallow. Case in point, the cover of the Ronettes, How Does It Feel? While I can kinda get behind the doo-wop harmonizing backup vocals and could see the instrumental of a track like this working in the context of being sampled in like a bent track or something, the ridiculously cutesy and high-pitched tone of the singing, especially when Caroline starts taking the lead about halfway through the tracks, gets to be way too shrill and annoying, and the whole thing has such a ridiculous level of fake-feeling sentimentality that makes the whole production borderline feel like either some old show tune from the 50s or like one of those old children's Christmas songs like Rudolph or Frosty the Snowman, which is probably my least favorite genre of all time, for the record. I mean, it's not completely intolerable or anything aside from the chipmunk-style singing, but it is saccharine to the point of being difficult to stomach. And even more difficult for me to stomach is a track like My Spinning Wheel, which despite having been originally written for this album, I would have sworn was a cover of like an old show tune from the 30s or 40s or something, being played completely straight without any twists. Already not my thing, but whatever possible emotional resonance this track could have had is once again ruined by the chipmunk-style singing, which is so keening and awful, and the track just freaking drags on for 6.5 minutes. Ugh. Yeah, that was definitely the lowest point of the album for me. I had an especially hard time with that one. Really, the only break I get from the overly saccharine tone of this early stretch of the album are a handful of interludes that are like 30 seconds each and seem to be played for a joke, so not really much of a break, if that. Though, to be fair, the interlude of Caroline playing Chopin on the piano and crying in a really contrived-sounding way while Susie looks on and says, "Wow, poor Caroline, she's so sad," being immediately followed by another interlude of Caroline supposedly playing the same piece on the guitar in the style of Jimi Hendrix, complete with picking the strings with her mouth, while Susie narrates and says, "Wow, poor Caroline, she's so sad. Life must be really hard for you." Okay, that was funny. That did get a genuine laugh out of me anytime I put this on. Well played. I also think the track Love Songs, Love is a Many Razor-Bladed Thing, has an interesting idea to it at first, just cutting out loads of samples of the word love being sung on a whole bunch of different 60s songs. Although the kind of show tune-ish ballad the track builds into in its second half isn't really to my taste either. This whole first third or so of the album was definitely not my cup of tea, though it is immediately after this point where things start to take much more of an unexpected turn that gets somewhat more intriguing. The track Medical Service has no musical elements to it at all. It's just a whole bunch of atonal electronic sound effects playing over lengthy sample narrations of a British guy talking about cancer and how it forms. 5.5 full minutes of that. Though, the two singers do chime in a bit to say, "Whoa, this is all very strange. Have we come to the wrong place?" And there's also 2 more experimental interludes where this British narrator, now played by Tomita himself as Dr. Domestic, treats some kind of illness in Caroline via physical effects to make her feel better. You hear a piece for turntables and records, which is just some kind of weird repeating fuzzy noise for like 2 minutes. As Caroline is going like, "Yeah, that feels good." And then there's a piece for electronic colored tone and strings, which is exactly what it says it is. The string section on here sounds really nice and has a solidly emotional quality to it that allowed this to be the first cut on the album since the title track that I could qualify as an actual highlight. While this whole little 3-track run with Dr. Domestic was more the kind of thing I respected for how hard a left turn it was than the kind of thing I got a lot of visceral enjoyment out of, I mean, it was a cool hard left turn, and there's nothing else on the album that sounds like it. I do think the album would be worse if these tracks were not there. Finally, though, we reached the album's 7-minute centerpiece, Time and Space. It is at this point where the album finally properly picked up for me and I started to get genuinely pulled in. Only about a half hour into a 70-minute album, but hey, better late than never. And I don't have nearly as much to complain about anything that comes after this point either. The album's second half is way, way stronger than its first half. Time and Space itself is quite possibly my favorite track on the album, and that's not just because it's the first time on the album that sees Yumiko Ono singing as Caroline Novak in a way that doesn't drive me up the wall. Her voice is still really high-pitched and cutesy in that special way you only get from certain Japanese singers, but at least it's no longer in chipmunk range, so it can be cutesy without being really grating and annoying. But that isn't nearly as notable to me as the instrumental, which takes influence from 60s bubblegum pop and surf rock, and layers loads of wobbly experimental electronic effects over itself through nearly its whole second half. It's basically a Stereolab track, circa Emperor Tomato Ketchup or Dots and Loops, right before the former of those two albums came out. I may not personally prefer this over Stereolab. I mean, Laetitia Sadier's much sadder sounding voice always makes for a much better emotional contrast to the bright peppiness of these kinds of instrumentals, compared to the much more twee singing heard on here. But this track was so spot on to that group's style and appeal that I had to wonder whether the group heard this album themselves and were inspired by it to start going in that direction with Emperor Tomato Ketchup onwards. Though I also wouldn't necessarily be surprised if they never interacted and just happened to reach the same endpoint by sheer coincidence. I don't know. I also kind of get mild Stereolab vibes off of the pure string section piece that immediately follows it, called Air Vibes. It's nothing but low-key emotional strings, but there is still a lightly playful energy present to the composition that reminds me of the Stereolab track Cybel's Reverie. Then there's a 1.5-minute interlude of the two singers talking over field recordings on board an airplane, and then we get to meet Susie's Auntie Kim singing Now That You've Gone by Petula Clark with an a cappella group. I do have somewhat of a suspicion that Auntie Kim may or may not just be Susie Kim herself, based on the way she's credited in the liner notes. But it's not like I'd be able to easily tell, since the voice is way deeper here than anywhere else on the album. She sounds like a completely different singer. For all I know, could just be someone else entirely also named Kim, that, according to Discogs, has never been credited on anything else before. The track itself is fine, but I much prefer the other cover of the exact same song that appears shortly after that, which plays the track more straight, complete with the old school 60s pop orchestrations, some thicker breakbeats in a few parts, which is kind of fun, and Susie and Caroline singing in kind of more the same cutesier style that they do on the rest of the album. I'm not sure what it is about this track that got it to work, where the other earlier moments on the album, like How Does It Feel or My Spinning Wheel, fell really flat for me. I mean, it is playing yet another really schmaltzy formula completely straight. But, you know, once again, the voices are not nearly as shrill or annoying as they were in the earlier parts of the album, which does allow the underlying appeal of the original track to be able to connect more effectively. And maybe it also helps that I don't feel like I'm listening to like an old show tune that came out in the 40s or 50s, but rather like I'm listening to one of those old 60s R&B songs that I heard all the time on the oldies station when I was a kid. I think I may have even heard the original Now That You're Gone on the oldies station when I was a kid. Which is a very subtle difference, but a key difference nonetheless that allowed it to actually connect with me. Oh yeah, and in between these two Now That You've Gone covers, there's also another cover of a different song, being Look for a Star, originally performed by Gary Mills, but this time performed by the Astro Age Steel Orchestra. Yeah, so you know how I mentioned Yann Tomita has been credited as Japan's first professional steel drum player? This is where he gets to explore that side to his sound. Just going full calypso, like we're in Super Mario Sunshine or some shit. That track is also fine, not really a standout, but add that to the increasing list of wild turns in genre that this album has taken. Anyway, after the second Now That You've Gone cover, there's a bunch of other original tracks that seem designed to directly segue out of that and, like, evolve into their own things. Through My Window is a little emotional lounge ballad with strings and vibraphones and pianos that sounds really nice. Also, I think is the only track on the album to have Japanese lyrics instead of English lyrics, which is kind of interesting. That's definitely one of the best tunes on here. And immediately building off that track's chord progression and sharing its string sections is the following track, Someday, That Place in Time, which kind of feels like it's acting as a credits roll type moment for the whole album. It shows the two singers saying goodbye to each other and promising to meet each other again another day. And, yeah, I mean, between the super sentimental tone of the strings behind them and the further context that this album never got a follow-up and that we'd never get to hear the Doopees reunite after this album, aside from, like, a couple of promotional EPs, it does allow this track to pick up a surprisingly strong emotional resonance. I didn't think an album which had previously hit such a ridiculously schmaltzy note that I couldn't even stomach it would go on to successfully get me kind of choked up a bit at the end. But kudos for having pulled that off. I guess it's just a demonstration of one of the best ways for something to effectively hit a sad note is to contrast it with something lighthearted to build up to it. Echoed all the more by the couple of monologues Susie and Caroline have with each other throughout this album about how life isn't just about feeling sad all the time, and it's not just about having a good time all the time. You need to have both the ups and the downs. This was the first, and possibly only, moment on the album where I could have even slightly understood the standpoint of someone who might hold this album up to a 10 out of 10 level. But it's still not quite the ending. The album ends in literally the only logical way an album full of cover songs, references, and sonic touch points from the bubblegum pop side of the 60s, and following a fictional singer called Caroline Novak to end. And that is, of course, with a cover of Caroline No by the Beach Boys. Not sung by either Suzy Kim or Yumiko Ono, but instead by Kiyoshi Hiyama, who is apparently known for, like, singing jazz standards and doing a crap ton of backup vocals for lots of different artists. This cover has none of the typical vocal harmonizing you'd expect out of a Beach Boys cover either. The singer is on their own with nothing but piano and vibraphone to back them up. I couldn't tell whether they were a man or a woman, honestly. Could go either way. But it is yet another really strong emotional note, and vibraphones are a great instrument to be focusing on. Also, if this ending got too sad for some, they do tack on a much more lighthearted outro that includes sound effects of a train, being joined by a completely out-of-nowhere nod to Kraftwerk's Trans Europe Express, which did get another genuine laugh out of me, as well as a dog barking and the two singers returning one last time to do some counting and laugh for a bit or something. So that's nice, and doesn't undercut the song either. But that's finally everything on Doopee time. Jesus, what a ride this whole thing has been. I am still not entirely sure what to make of all of it. There were some moments on this thing I thought were fantastic. There were some moments I thought were neat or had an interesting idea but didn't really grab me beyond the surface level. There were some moments I didn't care for at all. Truly a land of contrasts for me over here. As drastically as the album did pick up for me in its second half, I am still left like a lot of the material on this thing can feel like a shallow novelty to me. Like, interesting that it exists in the form that it does in the first place, and very easy to respect. Both for its obvious daring as well as the fact that there wasn't really anything comparable to it that I know of from this particular era. But, you know, also not necessarily speaking to me on a deeper level. The overabundance of cover songs doesn't necessarily help matters either. This is an album with a few deep ideas, but doesn't necessarily strike me as deep through its full running time, and I have no idea how much I would recommend it necessarily. But I suppose it's gotta be at least worth a shot. Both for how clearly influential it was, being the start of a line of Japanese plunderphonic artists in years to come that we can see today through the existence of artists like Handsome Boy Technique. Also in the sense that even if some of this album's appeal may end at shallow novelty for me, that novelty is so bizarre that it's guaranteed to at least be an interesting listen, and disarm even the most jaded of listeners. Also, obviously have to give credit to all the moments, especially through the second half of the album and near the end, that did successfully really hit for me or even get to me on an emotional level. I may not entirely know what to do with this. I kinda doubt I'll be coming back to it in its full entirety again after I put this video up, but my life was made all the more interesting by having experienced it, and albums like these that I never would have looked into on my own time are the whole reason I still do these Patreon requests. So, I guess take that all as you will. Clearly it found an audience who adores it from somewhere, so maybe you'll be able to join them yourself. And even with all my various all-over-the-place conflicted feelings on it, I think I'd still be able to say I enjoyed my time enough with it to let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.